now joined by Yofi Grant, who is the CEO of Ghana Investment Promotion Center. Thank you so much for talking to us. Obviously, industrialization is the main focus today, and looking at the different priority sectors. How do we drive industrialization, especially if we just juxtapose the two countries, Ghana and South Africa, similar resources, similar challenges? How do we work around that and navigate around that?
You pose a very interesting question, which is the key to the AfCFTA. Because, I mean, when you look at the African continent, this is a resource-rich continent. I mean, 90% of the world's platinum, 90% of the world's cobalt, 90% of the world's chromium, a significant proportion of the world's lithium, not to mention other minerals like copper, uranium, and all that. But for the longest, the continent has just been exporting these, raw materials, and it hasn't augured well for us moving further up the value chain. And our nations, as rich as the continent is, our people are still poor. And it's because we haven't added value to these. So industrialization is key to achieving the objectives of the AfCFTA. And of course, I mean, just not in these minerals, but in ordinary consumables. But then to make that happen, there are a number of equations that you need to solve. And as I did mention this morning, access to capital is one. And as you know, majority of the businesses in Africa are more or less SMEs and SMIs. I remember seeing a report by McKinsey a couple of years back where you don't even have more than 480 companies in Africa generating a turnover of $1 billion a year. Now, that is difficult for capital formation. And I guess that hasn't happened because we haven't looked at the demand side of our markets, which is huge. So Africa exports raw materials and imports finished goods on those raw materials when we should have been adding value on those raw materials right in situ on the continent. But to do that too, we need capital to invest in a number of things, just not in the manufacturing. We need capital for infrastructure so that we can connect to each other as countries. It's difficult. Some regions are better connected than others, but we want the whole continent to connect. And we did mention earlier, one of the biggest problems is traveling within Africa. It's much, much more difficult than even traveling from the continent to Europe.
Now, one of the things you did mention is actually the standards across the continent, but a lot of critics might actually argue that we're trying to create one standard across the continent and focusing on things that unite us, but also not paying attention to the differences also in the different markets and how the different trade blocs that already exist might actually be a stumbling block in driving investment across the continent. What do you say to that?
It also might be an opportunity. The fact that there are already regional blocs that have created their own standards, their own policies, etc. It makes it easier for regional blocs to negotiate than countries to negotiate. Africa is 55 countries. If you're talking, each one has to negotiate with itself. It's much more difficult than if you have 4 or 5 blocs who can negotiate with each other. So as much as it's a challenge, it's also a great opportunity. But at the end of the day, even when it comes to standards, there is one key denominator that we need to clearly understand in Africa, and that is competitiveness. How competitive is the product? And the competitiveness should not be between countries in Africa, but with other global producers. So if you're going to produce a car in Africa, how competitive is it with a car brought from Europe? That is what will create the demand, intracontinental demand, that we can make a product that has the same or better specs than other places because we know exactly what we want, and the pricing is such that we can afford it. So standardization is important. There are different standards across different regions, but at the end of the day, it's a competitiveness that you can actually elicit from the product that makes a lot of sense for trade. And if it's easier for me to buy a car from South Africa or from Morocco or from Kenya or Rwanda, why would I go all the way to import it from Europe and pay taxes when on the continent it's tariff-free?
Thank you so much for those insights. Of course, that was Yofi Grant, who is the CEO at Ghana Investment Promotion Center, just talking us through some of the discussions that have been taking place today. Of course, the focus being on free trade area, the agreements, and actually implementing, saying that the standards or getting standards across the continent might actually be an opportunity, and that there are blocks that already exist regionally might actually help fast track, the implementation of the African continental free trade area. For Newsroom Afrika on channel 405, I'm Dowazo Kumalo in Cape Town.